Thank you so much for leading us in worship like that this morning, Brian. And we're going to turn to the word of the Lord now. Over the last number of months at Corner Church, we have been working our way through an Old Testament prophet named Joel in a verse-by-verse study that I've been calling The Start is Near. And we're actually going to read the last passage in the book of Joel today and finish that series this morning. And I hope you'll be able to join us next week as we start a new series that I'm calling The New Normal. You know, as the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown restrictions start to lift and loosen, and we start looking at what some people are calling the new normal of life after COVID, I thought it might be good for us as God's people to look at His Word and just ask the Lord, what do His scriptures have to say to us about life in the new normal after COVID? And how we can and should be as Christians as we move into this new reality that we find ourselves in. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that series, and I hope it will be an encouragement and a help to you as you do. But for today, let's turn to the book of Joel, chapter 3, starting at verse 18, and let's hear the word of the Lord together. This is Joel 3, starting at verse 18. In that day, the mountains will drip with new wine, and the hills will flow with milk. All the ravines of Judah will run with water. A fountain will flow out from the Lord's house, and will water the valley of acacias. But Egypt will be desolate, Edom a desert waste, because of violence done to the people of Judah, in whose land they shed innocent blood. Judah will be inhabited forever, and Jerusalem through all generations. Their blood guilt, which I have not pardoned, I will pardon. The Lord dwells in Zion. And may the Lord add His blessing to the reading of His word. I thought we could start off today by doing a little bit of a year in review for 2020. Now, I know, we're nowhere near New Year's Eve, but it's just, I saw this meme the other day, and it got me thinking. Now, in case you don't recognize the reference, the singer in that picture is a rock and roll musician from the 1980s, whose most famousest song was Livin' on a Prayer. And the meme there is quoting the chorus of that song, whoa, we're halfway there. And no, I'm not going to try to hit the high note on that next part, but it goes on to say, living on a prayer, take my hand, and we'll make it, I swear. Well, nothing kills a good meme like explaining it, I know. But the truth is, when I saw that meme, I thought, oh, come on, I thought, we're halfway there? 2020 hasn't been as bad as all that, has it? And then I remembered how it all started, right? With the wildfires of Australia. Anybody remember the wildfires of Australia this January? When something like 19 million hectares of Australia, which is an area equivalent to about 1/5 the size of the entire province of Ontario, 19 million hectares of Australia went up in smoke. Well, it would be understandable if you had forgotten it, because it was followed very shortly by the Flight 752 disaster, right? Where the Iranian military shot down a Ukrainian passenger plane on January 8th, 2020, and everyone was wondering if a war was actually going to break out. Well, we didn't have much time to wonder about that, because only a couple of months later, right, on March 17th, 2020, the government of Ontario declared a state of emergency and put the province of Ontario into lockdown as the coronavirus pandemic swept across the globe, right, sending economies into a tailspin and nations into chaos. This isn't coming as a news flash to anyone, I hope. But it didn't even stop there, did it? Because, of course, on May 25th, 2020, the horrific killing of George Floyd by police officers in Minneapolis sparked massive riots throughout the United States and protests around the world crying out for racial justice. Whew. I mean, I'm not saying that 2020 is the worst year ever, but I am saying that when I saw this meme the other day, I could relate. And nothing kills a good meme like the explaining of it. So if you're not a Star Trek fan, please see me after the sermon this morning. But with everything that's been going on since the start of 2020, it could be that you could use a little bit of good news for a change. Huh? I know I could. And if so, then might I just direct your attention to our text this morning. This final passage in our verse-by-verse study of the book of Joel, where he looks at God's people way back in like 700 or 800 BC sometime. He looks at them as they are going through one of the worst years of their lives. Okay, after locust swarms have devastated their crops and famine has swept over their land and foreign armies have invaded and burned and looted and pillaged and destroyed, and after God himself has come to judge. Okay, after all of that, Joel looks at us. He looks at us and he says, Yeah, but there will be shalom for God's creation in the end. Friends, that's the good news today. Not just good news of the prophet Joel, but the good news of the whole entire Christian faith. This is our hope and our assurance that God will bring about shalom for his hurting world in the end. Now, it may be that you're new to the Christian faith, and it may be that you've never heard this word shalom before. So let me just take a brief detour here to explain what shalom really is, because you can't really understand the ending of the book of Joel without knowing something about this thing called shalom. Now, strictly speaking, shalom is just a Hebrew word that means peace. Shalom is peace. But it's not just peace the way we think about it, like putting an end to war or when two friends make up after a fight. No, shalom means peace, more in the sense of like universal flourishing and universal harmony. Okay, where everything in the creation is in its right place and everything is in its right relationship with the Creator, and everything is thriving and flourishing because there's no more sin anymore and there's no more violence, and the earth is full of the knowledge of the Lord, like the waters cover the sea. Friends, that's shalom. It's not just world peace, it's perfect heavenly peace. Everywhere, for everything, and everyone. And this is actually the central hope of the Bible, that one day there will be shalom. Well, an Old Testament prophet named Isaiah once put it like this. He said, "One day the wolf will lie down with the lamb and the leopard will lie down with the goat. And on that day the child will play near the nest of the cobra and won't be hurt by it. And there won't be nothing that hurts nor harms nor destroys on all God's holy mountain." Joel puts it even more poetically than that. Joel says, one day the mountains will drip with new wine and the hills will flow with milk, he says. And on that day, a fountain will flow out from the Lord's temple and bring healing and life. And there will be peace and there will be forgiveness and there will be mercy for all because, and I quote, because the Lord dwells in Zion. And all God's people said, Amen. Incidentally, Incidentally, Joel 3:18-21 may actually be one of the best Old Testament passages for understanding what shalom really looks like. Because here, Joel simply describes it all using the 3 R's. And no, I don't mean the 3 R's of school, right? Reading, writing, and arithmetic. And I don't mean the 3 R's of sustainability, right? Reduce, recycle, and reuse. As important as those 3 R's are, I don't mean those. I mean the 3 R's of shalom, which are restoration, reversal, and reconciliation. Or am I the only one who noticed those 3 R's in this passage? Because it starts, right? In verse 18, it starts with the restoration of creation. Now, this would stand out to you especially if you had been reading Joel with us from the beginning. Because in the beginning of the book, a locust plague had just swept through the land, leaving everything dead and dried up and dying. Okay, so just let it sink in here that when God's shalom finally does arrive, well, the whole creation is now restored. Okay, because here the mountains are dripping with wine again, and the hills are overflowing now with milk, right? I mean, everything, in other words, everything is green now and thriving and bursting with life because God has restored the creation. And he's reversed evil too. That's the second R, right? The reversal of evil. And again, this would stand out to you more if you were reading from the beginning, because in the beginning of Joel, the land was being invaded by foreign armies, right? Soldiers were sweeping in from the north, and violence was on the wind, and death was in the air, okay? And so let it just sink in now that here in verse 19, all of the violence and all of the innocent bloodshed has been reversed. Incidentally, this is what it means when it talks about Egypt being desolate and Edom being a desert waste. Because historically, Edom and Egypt were the enemies of Israel, right? So the fact that these countries are described here as being desolate means that there's just no war anymore. There's no more threat of invasion. There's no more evil. Because the second R of shalom is the reversal of evil. And that's what God is promising to do there in verse 19. But Corner Church, best of all, he's also promising to reconcile people back to himself. That's verse 20 and 21 there, where he promises that all of our own blood guilt, that is to say, our very real guilt for our own very real sins, even that will be forgiven, right? And we will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And again, once more, if you were reading from the beginning of Joel, you would see how good this news is too, okay? Because when the book of Joel began, God and his people were they were estranged from each other. The people were under God's judgment, and they were wallowing in their sin and their misery. And so here we see the best R of all. Because here at the very end, when everything's said and done, the people here at last are reconciled back to God himself. Quote, I will pardon their blood guilt, God says. I don't know if you're seeing it here the way I can see it, but what we have in Joel 3, chapter 3, verse 18 to 21, what we have here is a perfect picture of shalom, the restoration of creation, the reversal of evil, and reconciliation with God. And maybe now you can see why I call Joel 3 good news. Because in case you haven't heard, our world is still in desperate need of those 3 R's today. Like the creation is in desperate need of restoration, friends, today. And the Australian wildfires of 2020, those aren't the only or even the best evidence of that. The creation needs restoration. And we so urgently need to see evil reversed in our world today. I mean, the Black Lives Matter protests aren't the only or even necessarily the best evidence that that's true too, right? The world needs to have evil reversed. We're aching for justice and peace. And there are people in our world who are just as estranged from God as there were in Joel's day. Just as alienated and fearful and hurting and or hostile towards God as there were in Joel's day. Maybe more. Certainly no less. And certainly we need to see this world reconciled to God today just as much as it needed to be reconciled to God back then, right? I mean, if this is making sense to you, if it's making sense to you, then let me proclaim the good news to you this morning. Friends, God gives us his holy word this morning that there will be shalom for his creation in the end. And if you will let it, like if you will grab hold of that hope and hang on to it with all your might today, the hope of shalom, it will change how you see the world today in 2020. I mean, however miserable this first half of 2020 may have been, the hope of shalom can change how you see it. You might say to me, well, how? Pastor Dale, like how is God gonna do this? I mean, Joel spoke his message some 2,700 years ago, right? And the world is still just as desperately in need of shalom now as it was back then, right? So how is God going to bring about this vision of universal peace and harmony that you're going on and on about today? Well, let's just do a little Bible connect the dot this morning and see if we can't figure out how he's going to do it. Because notice in verse 18 there that Joel says that when shalom finally comes in all its goodness, when it comes, there will be, and I quote, there will be a fountain flowing out from the temple of the Lord's house. That is to say, a stream of life-giving water flowing out from the temple of God. Now, if you can, just hold that image in your mind for a second and flash forward about 1,000 pages, like to the very last chapter of the very last book of the Bible. I'm in the book of Revelation now, chapter 22. And just to set the stage here, Revelation chapter 22 comes just after the second coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, right? After Jesus has returned, and through his love and his wisdom, he has done away with the old order of things. And we're told a new heaven and a new earth has come. Okay? And then, after all that, in Revelation 22, verse 1, it says this. It says, there was a river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, a river of the water of life flowing from the throne of God, which is in the temple, by the way. A river flowing from the throne of God down the middle of the great street of the heavenly city. And on each side of the river, it says, there stood a tree of life bearing 12 crops of fruit every month, and the leaves of that tree are for the healing of the nations. Revelation 22. Do you still have Joel's vision in your mind of a day when a river of shalom flows out from God's temple to heal his hurting world? Can you connect that dot with this dot here in Revelation? Because here in Revelation, after Jesus has died on the cross to defeat every evil, and after he has risen again to new life, the resurrected Lord of all, and then after he's reigned over the world through the Spirit and by the ministry of the church for like who knows how long between then and now, right? But after he has reigned, and then after he has come again to judge the living and the dead. Like when it's all said and done, it's all said and done, and we're standing with him there on the other side of the second coming. Then the book of Revelation says, oh yeah, then on that day there's going to be a river, a bit like the one that Joel saw way back in 700 BC, a river of life flowing out from God's throne and bringing shalom wherever it goes. Corner Church, that's how God's going to bring about shalom in the end. Through the coming and the second coming of his Son, our Lord, Jesus Christ. It's not for nothing that they call him the Prince of Shalom, right? The Prince of Peace. And friends, when he comes again in glory to heal all things, however bad the year is that we're going through on that day, however bad the year might be, I assure you that on that day there will be shalom. So what do we do in the meantime? In this in-between time while we wait on him to do that? Well, might I suggest to you that you and I, here and now, we are supposed to be part of the mopping up operation. See, we're living at this point in the story of God that some people call the already not yet. Already not yet. Because we live on this side of the resurrection, right? Where God has already won the victory over evil through the resurrection of Christ. This victory is very real and it's already happened. Satan is already a defeated enemy, friends, and evil has already been overcome through the cross of Christ. But of course, at the same time, we live on this side of the second coming, don't we? This side of the second coming, where Christ has not yet returned, right? And so the victory he won on the cross has not yet healed the whole world, has it? Oh, sure, there are pockets where it's happened, for sure. Your own life may be one such pocket where Christ has stepped in and brought his shalom to you. But it's not yet touched everywhere and everyone and everything, has it? So we live in this middle reality, the already not yet tension, where we are already victorious and we are not yet at peace. I've heard it compared to the mopping up operations that the Allied army had to do after the invasion of Normandy on D-Day, June 6th, 1944. You do know about D-Day, don't you? D-Day, when something like 24,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy in the final major offensive that marked the beginning of the end of World War II. Right? Because D-Day was the decisive victory that turned the tide in the war. Even though the Allies lost something like 10,000 troops doing it, still the Allies actually won the war. They won the war when they won the Battle of Normandy. But everyone who knows their World War II history would say to me, well, Of course, World War II didn't end on June 6th, 1944, did it? I mean, VE Day, that is Victory in Europe Day, VE Day didn't actually come until May 8th, 1945, like a full year later. Because even though they won the Battle of Normandy, still there was a whole series of mopping up operations, weren't there? After the war was won on D-Day and before the ultimate victory was realized on VE Day, a whole series of mopping up operations. And some of those operations still included some pretty vicious battles against the enemy, didn't they? As the Allies continued to take ground and rout out the Nazis that were left. Because D-Day was a real victory. And the war was, in one sense, it was really won on that day. But still, it was not yet won, was it? And there was still a huge mopping up operation to do before the final victory could be celebrated. Well, if that makes sense to you, then follower of Jesus, let me challenge you today, as we sit here wondering if and how we're possibly going to get through the second half of 2020, let me challenge you today to know that you and I, if we are really followers of Jesus, you and I are part of the mopping up operation of God's shalom. I mean, Jesus has already won the victory over every evil that ever set itself against God's shalom. And now Jesus is asking us to work for shalom and to pray for shalom and to be agents of shalom in the world while we wait for that day when the victory that he won on the cross will be finally, fully realized. Like think for a minute about those 3 R's in the book of Joel, right? Restoration, reversal of evil, and reconciliation. You remember those? Well, what you are actually seeing there in those 3 R's was actually the job description of every Christian who is really following the Lord Jesus Christ. Friends, we are called. Yes, even while Australia is burning and pandemics are sweeping across the globe, still we are called to be people who bring restoration to God's creation, wherever sin has messed it up. And we are called to be the kind of people who always do whatever they can do to reverse the effects of evil, wherever we encounter it. Whether that means dismantling the systemic evil of racism on a national scale, because it could mean that, or whether it means just being a peacemaker in your home and your family, we are called to be reversals of conflict. And we're called to invite others to experience reconciliation with God, just like we've experienced it. I mean, that's why the Corner Church does stuff like Alpha. And, when we could meet in person, we did stuff like Kids Corner and all of our other outreach work, because we want everyone to experience God's shalom just as much as we have, to be reconciled to him through Christ like we have. And friends, that's our challenge today. While 2020 rages around the world, I mean, maybe especially because 2020 is raging around the world, our challenge is to catch hold of Joel's vision for God's shalom and let it inspire us to get to work, to get involved in the mopping up operation and start bringing his shalom to every corner of the world that's within our reach. If we'll do that, we may just find that the year 2020 turns out to be more like the year 1420 instead. And no, I don't mean 1420 AD. I mean 1420 SR. By the Shire reckoning. Okay, you know, the Shire, the home of the hobbits in The Lord of the Rings. Well, if all you've ever learned about The Lord of the Rings you got from the movies, you might never have heard about the year 1420 before, because the movies sort of gloss this part over. But 1420 SR is the first year after the destruction of the One Ring, the first year after the defeat of Sauron, the enemy. And 1420 is an especially wonderful year in the book. I mean, up until then, things had just kept getting darker and darker. The evil of Mordor kept getting stronger and stronger, and the plight of the men of the West kept getting grimmer and grimmer. And just when it seemed like things couldn't possibly keep going the way they were, at the last possible moment, Frodo was able to cast the One Ring into the fires of Mount Doom, and so defeat Sauron forever. Whew. So, sometimes things have to get really dark, I guess, so that you will recognize how beautiful the dawn is when it comes. Because after all of that, the story goes that the year 1420, the first year in the Shire after the destruction of the One Ring, was the most beautifulest year any hobbit could ever remember. And I don't know if Tolkien was thinking about Joel 3 specifically when he wrote this passage, but he was a Christian, right? And so I'm sure he knew all about Shalom at the very least. He must have known about Shalom, because this is what he says it was like the year after the ring was destroyed. And I quote, "Altogether, 1420 in the Shire was a marvelous year. Not only was there wonderful sunshine and delicious rain in due times and perfect measure, but there seemed to be something more. An air of richness and growth, a gleam of beauty beyond that of mortal summers that flicker and pass upon this middle earth. All the children born or begotten in that year, and there were many, were fair to see and strong. And most of them had a rich golden hair that had before been rare among hobbits. The fruit was so plentiful that young hobbits nearly bathed in strawberries and cream, and later they sat on the lawns under the plum trees and ate until they had made piles of stones like small pyramids, and then they moved on. And no one was ill, and everyone was pleased, except for those who had to mow the grass. In the South Farthing, the vines were laden, and everywhere there was so much corn that at harvest every barn was stuffed. And the North Farthing barley was so fine that the beer of 1420 malt was long remembered and became a byword. Indeed, a generation later, one might hear an old gaffer at an inn, after a good pint of well-earned ale, putting down his mug and with a sigh saying, "Ah, that was proper 1420, that was." And that's my best effort at making a Hobbit accent. Well, I mean, it might not be quaffing ale with the hobbits in the Shire for us. I mean, we're Nazarenes and Methodists, so most likely it won't be that. But whatever it does look like, friends, the hope of Shalom that God is holding out to us today, it will make even 1420 SR look pale in comparison. And it will make 2020 look like little more than a blip on the radar when we finally make it through.